Welcome to the channel, Dr. JWAU, theologist since 1994, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. The Life of Muhammad and the Verified Revelation Structure of the People of the Book, Episode 24, The Hostility of Separation as the Islamic Ideology developed. For the Muslim, the room no longer feels merely uncomfortable. It now feels divided. Conversations shorten when certain names appear. Smiles tighten. Silence lingers longer than before, and somewhere underneath the atmosphere, a quiet emotional calculation has already begun. Who still belongs? In the previous episodes, conscience pressure, preservation instinct, narrative protection, and inherited emotional conditioning progressively narrowed open examination as to Islamic ideology under the magnifying glass of the people of the books, Revelations. And in this episode, the next escalation emerges naturally from that process, the hostility of separation itself. Because once identity, truth, morality, belonging, emotional stability, and inherent meaning fuse deeply enough to a structure, separation rarely remains emotionally neutral. Eventually, divergence begins feeling threatening, and at first the hostility rarely appears openly violent. Usually it appears protective, concerned, morally justified, and the dissenter becomes spoken about differently. Questions begin surrounding suspicious instead of sincere. Distance starts being interpreted morally rather than intellectually, and eventually the listener quietly notices something important. The outsider is no longer merely viewed as convinced. The outsider increasingly becomes emotionally associated with the instability itself. That mechanism becomes extraordinarily powerful psychologically, because once preservation instinct begins requiring identifiable threat, emotional tension naturally starts projecting outward, and the atmosphere changes there. The Muslim who questions too openly may begin appearing dangerous, deceived, morally compromised, spiritually unstable, or socially threatening, not necessarily because evidence has been fully examined, but because separation itself now threatens collective emotional equilibrium. And that pattern appears repeatedly throughout authority structure history, especially once loyalty becomes identity. Disagreement becomes moralized. Unity becomes protective, and separation becomes existentially costly. Because once emotion survival becomes psychologically attached to preserving the collective structure, hostility towards divergence can begin forming automatically. Not always through visible commands, but sometimes through emotional conditioning alone. A pause in the room, a warning disguised as concern, a subtle distancing. Because the nervous system notices before language fully explains itself. And eventually many individuals begin policing boundaries emotionally because the atmosphere now interprets separation itself as destabilizing. The Quran repeatedly reinforces allegiance, separation boundaries, and loyalty structures surrounding belief communities. Quoting Quran 3:118, it reads, "O you who have believed, do not take as allies those outside your ranks who will not spare you ruin." And that reinforcement matters enormously now, because once outsiders begin feeling psychologically associated with corruption, danger, instability, or moral contamination, open examination narrows rapidly. The emotional transition becomes subtle, very subtle. The individual still believes moral discernment is occurring, but the atmosphere increasingly rewards conformity, visible loyalty, emotional alignment, and collective preservation, while divergence begins carrying relational suspicion automatically. And that's where the separation pressures evolve into relational enmity, not always hatred openly expressed, sometimes emotional coldness alone, sometimes suspicion, sometimes inherited distrust, sometimes moral reframing of the dissenter. And eventually the listener quietly recognises the deeper shift. The structure no longer merely preserves belief, it begins preserving itself against perceived threat. And that distinction matters enormously, because throughout biblical revelation structure, truth remained accountable to open verification rather than emotionally enforced hostility toward examination, dissent, or separation. The Bereans in the scriptures examined claims carefully against the scripture, rather than treating disagreement, investigation, or outsider questioning as automatic threat exposure. Because verified revelation survives scrutiny without requiring emotional hostility, inherited suspicion, relational exile, or fear-conditioned outsider framing to preserve allegiance. And once the atmosphere begins psychologically associating separation itself with danger, discernment often narrows long before individuals fully recognise how deeply preservation instinct has begun governing their emotional response towards others. I'm Dr. JW. Like, subscribe, press the bell if you like the content, comment to educate me, share the video to help somebody else. In the next episode, we move into the emotional exile, because once hostility towards divergence stabilises deeply enough, separation itself increasingly begins carrying loneliness, rejection, and relational abandonment inside the atmosphere. Till then, bye for now.